Resignation, reaction. The aftershocks continue from former Cardinal McCarrick's abuse allegations. The highest-ranking American at the Vatican is denying he knew. Missile making. U.S. intelligence officials believe North Korea may be building more missiles. We have reaction from the White House. Humanitarian crisis. The Pentagon updates the situation in Syria, where peacekeepers are leaving and citizens are caught in the crossfire. And an alternate universe. Why 70,000 boys and girls are spending the week in Rome. On EWTN News Nightly for Tuesday, July 31st, 2018. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you to those of you joining us from around the world for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Lauren Ashburn. The highest-ranking American at the Vatican insists he never knew about his former boss's alleged sexual misconduct. Cardinal Farrell worked as an auxiliary bishop of Washington, D.C., while then Cardinal Theodore McCarrick led the diocese.
People can say, well, you must be a right fool that you didn't notice. I must be a right fool, but I don't think I am. And that's why I feel angry.
During an interview with the Associated Press, Cardinal Farrell insists there are no records about McCarrick's alleged behavior and that if there had been, he would have known about it. Vatican correspondent Juliet Lindley joins us from Rome. Juliet, why is Cardinal Farrell speaking out now?
Lauren, it's possibly because there is a certain degree of anger being directed specifically at Cardinal Farrell, as some think that he must have known something about the activities of then Cardinal McCarrick. Now, Farrell served as an auxiliary bishop to McCarrick for 5 years in Washington, Lauren, from 2001 to 2006, and he lived in the same apartment building as McCarrick and other priests. So Farrell is very forcefully making clear here that he had no idea what was going on and that he's angry at having been deceived.
Former priest is alleging that McCarrick invited him and other seminarians to a beach house in New Jersey. Did Cardinal Farrell know that?
Cardinal Farrell is telling the AP that he would have known if McCarrick had invited seminarians to the beach house. Farrell added that at no time did any person from New Jersey or from New York ever speak to him about it. As a matter of fact, Lauren, he said that he never heard a word about any such matters of sex abuse. And Farrell said, quote, what Cardinal McCarrick was doing here, there, and everywhere and all over the world didn't enter into my daily routine of the running of the Archdiocese of Washington. While McCarrick has denied allegations of abuse, the Vatican announced Saturday that Pope Francis had accepted his resignation from the College of Cardinals, Lauren, and had ordered him to conduct a life of prayer and penance before a church trial is held. A member of the Pope's Commission for Child Protection, Father Hans Zollner, we talked to him and he's telling us that the Holy Father's move sends a clear message that all levels of the church hierarchy have to take their share of responsibility.
Juliet, the issue of sex abuse isn't just in this case, it's dominating headlines across numerous countries around the world, including Chile, where a meeting of its bishops' conference is underway this week. What is the focus?
Ron, the bishops this week in Chile will primarily try to pinpoint the causes of this sex abuse scandal in Chile, and then they're going to work to establish national guidelines for how to manage abuse cases going forward. The gathering comes on the heels of Cardinal Ricardo Ezzati-Andreu of Santiago, a past president of the Chilean Bishops' Conference, and he was summoned for questioning by local authorities, and they wanted to know if he covered up a case of abuse by a priest. Now, the Cardinal has denied any misconduct, and the authorities in Chile are investigating sex abuse charges against nearly 160 church officials involving 266 victims. Lauren, you may remember earlier this year, all of the bishops of Chile offered to step down. Pope Francis so far has only accepted the resignations of 5 Chilean bishops.
And Juliet, on a lighter note, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about what's going on behind you. Altar boys are there for a convention, and we will have more about that later in the show. Juliet Lindley, EWTN News Nightly Vatican correspondent. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren.
The Bishops' Conference of Honduras denies a report saying a homosexual culture exists in its main seminary. The story appeared in the National Catholic Register, owned by EWTN. The report cites nearly 50 letters from seminarians alleging active homosexuality. The country's bishops say, with complete certainty and truth, the report is false. The Register stands by its story. For more on the story, including the report that prompted the bishops' response, visit the National Catholic Register at ncregister.com. And the Catholic University of America rescinds an honorary degree it gave Cardinal McCarrick. The school says in a statement, quote, "The entire Catholic University community offers our prayers and pastoral support for the survivors, that they and their families encounter healing and peace. It is the first time the Washington, D.C. school has taken back an honorary degree." Joining me now is Mary Rice Hasson, director of the Catholic Women's Forum at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Mary, welcome back to the program.
Thank you very much.
Bishop Edward Scharfenberger of Albany, New York, wrote this. He sent a pastoral letter to his priests about this McCarrick scandal, and wrote, "Many of our faithful are now feeling betrayed and abandoned by their spiritual fathers, especially the bishops." Catholics are wrestling with how to respond to this abuse of power. What do you see as the essential steps needed to bring about a true spiritual reform?
Spiritual reform is really the answer. And I think one of the issues, one of the reasons why Catholics are angry, and not just feeling betrayed, but are angry with the response and sort of the lack of accountability, is because the first statements acknowledging this talked about the need for procedures, the need for bishops to be held accountable and reporting mechanisms, but the problem is far deeper. And that's what was wonderful to see in Bishop Schellenberger's statement.
Only a handful of bishops have spoken out publicly. I spoke to Bishop Michael Olson of Fort Worth, Texas yesterday, and he said that the answer is prayer and work. Does the scandal put the moral credibility of the bishops in jeopardy if it is not resolved forcefully and quickly?
Oh, I think it's already in jeopardy. I really do. And I think that's because there was a chance in 2002 for this to be addressed in terms of the reporting of bishop misconduct. But again, the problem is deeper. There's a question of how much active homosexuality is going on among the clergy and how the bishops are going to deal with that.
You're talking about the Promise to Protect, Pledge to Heal document that was created in 2002 after the sexual abuse crisis from that time. And in it, the bishops were not held accountable.
Right. They exempted themselves from those requirements. And that's in the past. That's what they did, and that was in error. But the problem since then has been not just a failure to comply with some mechanism that wasn't created, but it's deeper than that. It's an atmosphere of tolerating misconduct, of knowing that some of their brother bishops are perhaps not living up to not just their promises, but are abusing their power and abusing minors and failing to correct. And it's that willingness that we need to see on the part of the bishops to correct each other, that spirit of fraternal correction and that call to holiness.
It creates doubt in the minds of many that the church is effectively addressing this catastrophe.
Reasonably. You know, I think it's reasonable for people to wonder, because the procedures that were put in place in 2002 for the reporting of abuse of minors by clergy were good procedures, and those have worked. But again, you see the problem of the bishops exempting themselves, but that doesn't get to the whole problem, because we know from the stories and the settlements that occurred around Cardinal McCarrick, the problem is deeper. It's abuse of power relating to seminarians, and it's just simply a disregard of that vow of celibacy.
Mary Rice Hasson, director of the Catholic Women's Forum at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Always a pleasure to have you. Thank you.
It's great to be here.
An appeals court today sides against the Archdiocese of Washington in its lawsuit against the city's Metro Transit Authority. The church sought to use a Christmas-themed ad on city buses. Metro rejected the ad, saying it does not use religious advertising. U.S. spy agencies accuse North Korea of trying to build new missiles. The setback could hurt President Trump's push for peace. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Lauren. Published reports cast doubt on President Trump's claims of victory last month. Evidence shows he may have dismissed North Korea's nuclear threat too soon. Tonight, new satellite photos suggest work is underway on one, possibly two intercontinental ballistic missiles at a research facility outside Pyongyang. The images could reveal a different agenda less than 2 months after North Korea leader Kim Jong-un shook the president's hand at their historic meeting. They signed an agreement to work toward complete denuclearization of the Korean peninsula.
We haven't had a missile fired off in 9 months. We got our prisoners back. So many things have happened so positive.
The president referring Monday to one promise kept from Chairman Kim: the return of U.S. service members remains killed in the Korean War. But Kim isn't as keen to remove his missiles. Last week, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo confirming he may be producing even more.
North Korea continues to produce fissile material.
Yes, they continue to produce fissile material.
In June, the president quickly signaled victory after returning from his summit with Kim Jong-un. At the time, he claimed there is no longer a nuclear threat from North Korea. That may not be true, but there are some signs of progress. Generals from North and South Korea met today to hammer out differences and build trust between the two sides. This South Korean general says the two sides agreed to restore military hotlines and discussed ways to de-escalate the area along their shared border. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo heads to a forum in Singapore this weekend focused on security throughout Asia. North Korea's foreign minister will be present. A meeting between the two is possible but not confirmed. Lauren.
Mark, we're learning about the future of White House Chief of Staff John Kelly today. Tell us about that.
Yes, Lauren, reports say Chief of Staff John Kelly told senior aides that President Trump asked him to stay in his role through 2020. Kelly hit the one-year mark as Chief of Staff earlier this week. He is credited with bringing order to the West Wing. Speculation about his exit has flared for months, but he's telling staffers that he's agreed to stay on. Lauren.
White House correspondent Mark Irons. Thank you, Mark. A Coptic Orthodox bishop in Egypt is dead in mysterious circumstances. A Vatican news service says Bishop Epiphanius was found Sunday morning in a pool of blood. The 64-year-old had what appeared to be a head wound, and authorities are investigating. Syrian forces loyal to President Bashar al-Assad claim a major military victory. They've taken back a key piece of land from ISIS, which they've been fighting about for 7 years. But it's not a victory the U.S. or its allies are celebrating. Correspondent Wyatt Goolsby reports from the Pentagon. Good evening, Wyatt.
Good evening, Lauren. President Assad's forces consider this a breakthrough, retaking a part of Syria they haven't controlled since the start of a 2011 rebel uprising. The latest military operation comes after a wider 6-week-long campaign aimed at retaking control of the southwest corner of the country, which has, as of late, been under the control of ISIS militants. The U.S. and its allies say this recent fighting is adding fuel to an ongoing humanitarian crisis. Just days before this operation, a United Nations envoy reported more than 7,000 children have lost their lives or been injured in the Syrian conflict since 2013. Some have said the unofficial number is way beyond 20,000.
Mortars and rockets, indiscriminate shelling and improvised explosive devices have been used against civilian areas and civilian infrastructures and have had a deadly toll on children.
Today, a coalition general speaking via satellite says they are working with their partners in Syria and Iraq to protect civilians. The U.S. and its allies are also fighting ISIS in Syria, but they do not support Bashar Assad's government.
General, I'm hoping you can just tell me a little bit about how the humanitarian crisis in Syria impacts the coalition.
That's very much response there is very much led by the civilian agencies and most importantly the United Nations. And we do all we can to support the United Nations in their operations to support IDPs and refugees.
During today's press briefing, the general would not say if there is anything being done specifically to address minorities in Syria and Iraq, like Christians and Yazidis who've been targeted by ISIS. Back in southwest Syria, some humanitarian activists, a group known as the White Helmets, remain trapped in part of the area the Syrian government now claims to control. The Assad regime has reportedly refused to allow some of them to evacuate, reportedly because President Assad believes some of them are fighting against him. Lauren?
Correspondent Wyatt Goolsby reporting from the Pentagon. Thank you, Wyatt. At least 11 people in the Philippines are dead after a bomb detonates during the search of a van. The Islamic State claims responsibility. The attack reignites terrorism fears in the southern part of the Catholic country. President Duterte last week signed an agreement with the largest Muslim rebel group to bring peace to the south. But smaller extremists opposed the deal. At least 26 people are dead following 2 attacks in Afghanistan. They are the latest casualties in this 17-year war. But Reuters reports earlier this week a senior U.S. diplomat met with Taliban officials to talk about a ceasefire, and the talks ended with, quote, very positive signs. A ruling yesterday by the UK Supreme Court is worrying the faithful. The court says legal permission is no longer needed to end care for patients in a long-term vegetative state. Critics say it will become easier to end the lives of those who cannot speak for themselves. The decision might affect 24,000 patients. Coming up, a veteran Washington journalist weighs in on the Paul Manafort trial. And Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh remains on the hot seat. The trial for President Trump's former campaign manager begins today in Alexandria, Virginia. Paul Manafort faces charges of tax evasion and bank fraud. He denies the claims, and the case is not expected to focus on potential collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia. For this trial, special counsel Robert Mueller and his team have lined up 35 witnesses and more than 500 pieces of evidence. Joining me now is Larry O'Connor, Washington Times columnist, host of The Larry O'Connor Show on WMAL Radio.
That's a great name, doesn't
here
it?
in D.C. Larry O'Connor's a great name.
I know. No, the show, they said, we're going to do a Larry O'Connor show. We got to hire a guy, and luckily, I had the name.
Okay, you know, he also does comedy every night down the street.
You got to laugh in this town, you know that.
You sure do. Let's talk about jury selection in the Manafort case.
Yeah,
There's still time for him to cut a deal? No? Yes?
Yeah, and I think a lot of people observing this think that that's what this is really all about, and that's why so many people who are supporting the administration are looking at this with a pretty skeptical eye. People have to understand, first of all, listen, Paul Manafort could very well have broken the law, and if he did, he should be dealt with. Justice should be served here.
But this is nothing to do with collusion.
Absolutely nothing to do with collusion. The fact that Robert Mueller's investigation sort of brought this in suggests that they're really trying to press him, push him, and force him into a deal.
Or they just want him to have a trial about the fact that he didn't pay taxes.
Right. Well, yeah, but so what's interesting is there was another thing that they uncovered about Michael Cohen, the president's personal attorney. They handed that off to a different part of the Justice Department, the Southern District of New York. This one they kept, which means that they're using it for their own purposes, I think. The other interesting thing about the charges against Paul Manafort, and again, could very well be guilty, he deserves his day in court, the Justice Department years ago passed on this whole case. This took place years ago. He was doing some lobbying for the Ukrainian government or interests in Ukraine, made tens of millions of dollars apparently, and allegedly kept it offshore, didn't pay taxes. Justice Department looked at it, they investigated, they said, yeah, we're not going to prosecute.
That's the reason
now
why everybody is talking about this. Let's move on to Rick Gates. Rick Gates, that was his mentor. Paul Manafort was his mentor. Yeah. He was another campaign aide. He cut a deal, unlike Manafort. What is his testimony going to do?
That's a lot of people are looking at that. And in fact, what's interesting is this is the only person associated with the Trump campaign, Paul Manafort, that is, who has not cut a deal. He is standing firm and saying, I am not guilty. Mr. Gates did cut an agreement, and the understanding is that he's got some evidence against Manafort. And we'll see. What seems clear, though, is that none of his testimony will have anything to do with linking the Trump campaign with Russian oligarchs and some sort of scheme or some sort of conspiracy to undo the 2016 election.
Manafort faces another trial in September with 7 additional charges. It's going to focus on that work for the Ukraine. Is it realistic to think that this man is going to avoid prison time?
Well, I think it's too soon to tell. We're selecting the jury today. I mean, it's often said that the Justice Department and the federal government won't bring charges unless they have a pretty clear case. But understand, Robert Mueller has a history of actually bringing charges, and some of the people on his team, actually, the attorneys that he has, brought charges against the people involved with Enron, you'll remember. That ended up getting thrown out at a higher court.
Enron was the company in Texas.
Right, the energy company that was guilty of, well, they were found guilty, but then again, those charges were thrown out by a higher court. So people think that, corruption, by the way, I didn't finish my sentence. People think sometimes that just because the feds bring a case, that means that it's a cut and dry guilty. Not necessarily, and Mueller himself has a history of this.
You know, before we go, and I'm being told we have to go right now.
All right.
But well, before we go, the interesting piece about this is that this is really palace intrigue in Washington. Not so sure across the country.
Yeah, in fact, I open my phone lines here in Washington. I talk to people in West Virginia, Maryland. They don't want to talk about it. They don't care about it. They think it's a distraction. It doesn't matter to their lives about what's going on in their homes and their neighborhoods. But this is what this town feeds off of.
Larry O'Connor, Washington Times columnist, host of The Larry O'Connor Show on WMAL.
Thanks.
Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy's retirement takes effect today, and still no word on whether Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, the first Democratic senator to sit down with Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh, will support him.
We're going to continue to work through this process. I've told him, my thing is now is wait until he has his judiciary hearing. When the hearing is over, I will want to call him back in to sit down.
Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer wants more documents released from Kavanaugh's time in the George W. Bush administration. Kavanaugh is nominated to replace Kennedy, who was the Supreme Court's decisive man in the middle on abortion and other contentious issues. Up next, what do you get when you bring 70,000 altar servers to Rome? A lot of noise. And one diocese push for more Gregorian chants. The United Nations says an estimated 78 million babies are in danger within the first hour of their life. The culprit? A lack of breastfeeding. The group says not being fed in the first hour increases chances of disease and even death. The study is part of World Breastfeeding Week. Altar servers know it's usually best to be quiet, but that rule went out the window today at St. Peter's Square. An annual pilgrimage to Rome brought together 70,000 altar boys and girls, and today they met the Pope. The pilgrims are ages 13 to 23 and come from 19 countries. The motto for this year's week-long event is Seek Peace and Pursue It. Finally tonight, the Archdiocese of San Francisco is teaching children and teens how to sing Gregorian chant. The week-long chant camp included rehearsals and ended last week with Mass. Organizers say it taught children the meaning of the liturgy and the importance of participating in it. The director says one priest told her campers get more catechesis at chant camp than they do the rest of the year. And as St. Augustine noted, right? When we pray in song, it's almost as if we're praying twice. That does it for all of us here at EWTN News Nightly. To all of you around the world, thank you for watching. I'm Lauren Ashburn. Let's keep in touch online. Follow me at Lauren Ashburn on Twitter and Lauren Ashburn EWTN on Facebook. Good night and God bless.